professor in political science at the University of California, Davis, and a leading expert on agenda setting. Her research explores the interaction between media and politics, focusing on the causes, dynamics, and political effects of media attention and framing. And we really look forward to hearing all your insights. Thank you so much for being here today. Amber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma. It's really kind of you. I'm just thrilled to be here. It's lovely to connect with people who I remember fondly, and new people who I am meeting for the first time from Europe. And it's great to be here. Emma, can you confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect.
Everything
Excellent.
looks good.
All right. I think we don't think about agenda setting as much as I would like us to, because it's a simple concept. It's a relatively simple concept, I think, and yet it underpins so much of what we know about political communication. My thought today is that I'll just spend about half an hour as we talked about setting the stage to think about the core concepts of agenda setting, a couple of key facts that we know about media agenda setting thus far, and then I'll talk about some new work that I've just come up with about media storms, which are sudden surges in news coverage at a very high level, building on work that I've done with others, including Renz, who's on the call, and Stefan, who is probably there somewhere. So agenda setting is quite simply setting the agenda. And I think it's helpful to have our terminology. So I'll start with this definition. It's simply setting the agenda. It's deciding what it is that you want to talk about. And so you set the agenda when you go to lunch with a friend and you bring up a conversation topic, and an executive, a president or a prime minister sets the agenda when they talk about something as opposed to talking about something else. And that's really the key, is that when we set the agenda, we're not just focusing on one thing, but we're not focusing on all of the other things that we could be talking about at the same time. And in that way, agenda setting is really power, right? It's deciding what is important, and then by extension, what is relatively not important. And agenda setting is important to study, I would argue, in all of the contexts, on every agenda: the legislative agenda, the public agenda, the executive agenda, the judicial agenda. But I would say that it's especially important to study in the context of the mass media agenda, because all of those other agendas respond in some way directly to what is being talked about in the news. Cohen, way back in 1963, says it, I think, very nicely, that the press, that is the news media, may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. Which is to say that if you live really probably anywhere in the world right now, your news media might not be very helpful in telling you what to think about the current American Trump administration, because you probably already have your own views, right? But it's going to be very, very important in telling you which aspects to think about. And so when we think about the media agenda, we commonly think of it in that way, that the media agenda drives the public agenda. When there's something in the news, something about immigration or something about climate change, that we're more likely to hold it front of mind. It's more likely to influence us when we're deciding who to vote for, or deciding whether or not to give money to a cause, all kinds of things. It's really important that we recognize that it's not just that it goes in that direction. It's also the case, and studies have found statistically, that the public agenda also influences the media agenda, as do all of the other agendas, right? So when the president talks about something, the media is going to reflect what the president is saying. And when the courts make a big decision, the media is going to talk about that. And so all of these different agendas are interwoven. But again, I would argue that the media agenda is at the center of this big nest. When we think about the media agenda influencing the public agenda, it's true what Cohen said, that it's rarely good at telling us what to think. It's stunningly successful at telling us what to think about. But I would argue that in telling us what to think, it's not just that it gives us a topic to think, about, it also gives us a way of framing that topic. So it doesn't just tell us about something that is happening with immigration or climate change, but it tells us about some aspect of that thing that inevitably shapes which dimension or which frame of that issue that we're going to keep in the forefront of our mind. And in doing that, it definitely affects how we think about something. And in doing so, will likely influence what we think at the end of the day. Because if I, support a given policy on these dimensions, but I oppose it on these other dimensions, if the news media can coax me to think about it on these dimensions instead of those, then it's going to change the way that I think about it. Any questions before I move on? Okay. All right, so now I want to move on to two big facts that we know about the news media agenda setting process. And these facts, I think, are important because if we take this as a given, and I think we should, that the media agenda is very helpful in shaping the public agenda, then we need to ask what is that media agenda composed of? How does it get created? And the news generation process is one that I think a lot of people take for granted. They assume that there's an event that happens in the world, and so the news media cover it. And what that means is that there's no way of predicting what news outlets are going to talk about. But in fact, because there are so many events in the world, and because journalists can only focus on so many things at a time, what that means is that there are patterns of agenda setting that happen within news outlets, not because they're trying to only give us part of the picture, but because they're doing their job and they're working under journalistic constraints. And what this means is that there are two main facets of how the news generation process unfolds that I think we really need to pay attention to. There are lots, but these two I think we need to pay attention to. And the first is that the agenda is quite skewed across topics. And the second is that the agenda changes in a punctuated equilibrium way over time. So I'll just talk through that briefly. I'm going to use some old data here, but I think it's the best data to illustrate these points. All right, so the first point is that the media agendas are skewed, whereby some issues get really the lion's share of attention. Can everyone see the lion? Thank you. Some issues get the lion's share of attention, and other issues, see the mouse? Did you see how I put the mouse in? Other issues get very, very little attention or no attention at all. And so again, it's really important, right, what the news media are paying attention to, because there are so many other things in the world that are also very important that we would probably like them to be paying attention to as well, that don't get any coverage at all. So that's the first thing to know about the news media. And we can decide whether that's a feature or a bug, but it's definitely a trait, and it's a long-standing trait of news outlets. And this is a fact about the news generation process. So here's some very old data I want to show you. And let's think about the media agenda as a pie. And in the Policy Agendas project, one of the magical things we can do is to categorize all of the news articles according to topic. And in the particular coding scheme that I am going to use for this graph, there are 27 different topics. Topics like healthcare and defense, but also things like weather and sports, right? So 27 different topics. And if we thought about how to divide this pie, this finite agenda space, across these different topics, then I'd invite us to consider what that would look like. And we might naively think that it's just evenly divided across the 27 topics, but we would be wrong, of course. And so it in fact looks like this, where there are just almost 3 issues, right, that capture nearly 50% of the agenda space. And this is old data, but I promise if we replicated these graphs today with data from the last year, it would look the same. In fact, I would argue that given the geopolitical events of the last year, it would probably look even more skewed. It would look even stronger. So then the question, of course, is what are the issues that are taking up these top spheres? Does anyone want to guess? I don't know if this is a participatory thing. Would anyone like to guess? You can do it. I believe in you.
Migration.
Migration. Okay. Any other guesses?
Weather?
So weather, good guesses. Yeah. So Emma, I bet you're right that if we looked at just the last year and we looked at New York Times news coverage, we probably we'd see what, what we would term immigration as one of the top stories. But when we look across time, this is what it looks like. Remember that this is the US newspaper, the New York Times, right? It covers a lot of international affairs, but it also covers a lot of defense, a lot of government operations like elections, law and crime, healthcare, all the same. And you can see, Emma, that the one that is labor and immigration, so that dark blue is it's right under fires. It was so little that I didn't even note it. So what this tells you is that if you care about something like education, for example, then this trait of news coverage, that it generally doesn't pay a lot of attention to smaller issues and it gives the lion's share of attention to these bigger issues, then this tells you something important about how you should spend your resources, right? Because it's going to be an uphill battle to try to get anything about education into the news. All right, that's the first main trait that we know about the news generation process and about news coverage, that it is skewed in its agenda. And the second big thing, there's a hummingbird. The second big thing that we know is that all agendas, including the news agenda, follow a pattern of punctuated equilibrium, where we have periods of relative stasis, where the hummingbird is fixated on the flower, and then abrupt change, where the hummingbird zips off to a new flower. This is true with all agendas, but it's maybe especially true with the media agenda, because the media ecosystem is so complicated, but also because in the media ecosystem, there is a lot of trying to one-up each other and trying to get the scoop on a story. And so that means there's a lot of mimicking. And that mimicking means that those ebbs and swells are going to be even more dramatic than they are, say, in the legislature. So I want to show you the same pie chart again to animate this and put it into motion. Here's the same pie chart that I showed you again, and we're going to walk through the year 2001, which most of you on the call don't remember, but that was the year that the September 11th attacks happened. And so the New York Times, we know, is going to cover this quite strongly. But what I want us to see is how the agenda is relatively stable from one month to the next until a big event happens, and then all of a sudden it erupts into a big change. So here's April of 2001. Here's May of 2001, June. See how it's changing a little bit. It's responding to real events, but it's roughly the same. Here's July, here's August, and then here's September. And the September 11th attacks happening on the 11th happened a full third of the way into the month, right? And so with only 2/3 of the month to cover it, it's still completely occupied the front page of the news. But then it didn't go away, it stayed. So now that the hummingbird has found its important hot news flower, it's staying there. And so here's October, and here's November, and here's December. And you can see that the events of September 11th are now bleeding over also into international affairs. And then here's January. And what I think is interesting about January is that it's not as though, at least from American New York Times perspective, it was not as though the facts on the ground had changed much since the month before in December, right? There was still just as much to talk about. But what happened in February is that there was this Enron scandal, this big banking scandal. And so it had to be accounted for. They had to talk about it. And what that meant was that it pushed this ongoing, continuing to be important event of September 11th and the military intervention that happened after that. It pushed it squeezed it down to a smaller pie slice. And then last graph, in February of 2002, guess what that was?
Olympics movie?
It is the Olympics. It is the Olympics. And more the news generation process is that you have to cover big banking scandals and you have to cover the Winter Olympics. And so what this means is that when there is the Winter Olympics, if there's anything else going on in the world, it's not going to have as much agenda space to go around. Okay, so if we zoom out and look at the same data, but over this bigger time period, we can see this blip, right? What I will call a media storm, what Walgrave and Hardy and Blegenhart and I have called media storms. And these media storms are really important in the short range of these couple of years. But if we zoom way out, you can see that these media storms really completely disrupt the entire landscape of the agenda. And at least in this case, in a way that's stuck, right? The media agenda before that September 11th period looks different than the media agenda after that period. And so when we think about media storms, then I would argue that this is the most important thing for us to understand in the scholarship today. Are these sudden large surges in news coverage? How often do they happen? Do they happen consistently across different types of media systems around the world? What kinds of effects do they have? But also, and this is the work that I'm very excited to present to you today, how do they come about? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions? To begin with, we know that media storms have three criteria that we've set out in the literature, plus an implicit fourth one. So it has to be a big, large volume of attention. It has to have changed dramatically from the period before it. It has to last for at least a week. And the implicit criterion that is the fourth one that is always met in practice is that it can't just be a media storm in a single news outlet. It has to be a media storm across the given media ecosystem. What's really important about this list of criteria, I think, is that they could be applied to media storms in different contexts. So in the literature, they've been traditionally looked at, and I'm going to look at them right here, in a news context of news in a given nation. But we could look at these media storms and adjust the criteria accordingly if we wanted to look at global media storms or city level media storms, or media storms that aren't in the traditional news, but instead on TikTok, right? So this concept of a media storm, I think, is quite important, and I think it's quite flexible. It can be used across different contexts, and that's important because media storms are important. So most of the time, we don't see a media storm. Only about 10% of coverage falls into this media storm category. And yet those media storms, those are the ones that we remember, right? Those are the ones that really catch our interest. And those are the ones that stick with us as a society and have the potential to change things. Literature has shown pretty clearly that media storm coverage has a stronger effect than non-storm coverage. So if you have a given news article, if it comes in the context of a media storm, it has a statistically significantly higher effect, at least in the US, on congressional reaction to that topic than if the same news article happens outside of a media storm. And we also know that during a media storm, those are these interesting periods where the news agendas of different outlets in the media ecosystem become more congruent. Of course, because if there's some big thing that happens, a natural disaster, let's say, all the news outlets are talking about that big event. And so those news agendas are more congruent. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing because, or again, if you care about education, right, then especially then during that aftermath of a storm, you're not going to be able to get your chosen topic of education into the agenda. But it does mean that at minimum, the people in a given area are getting similar messaging from these different news outlets, which could mute the ongoing growing effects of the affective polarization across different news outlets. The other thing that is critical to note is that these media storms can be windows of change. They can have this opportunity to adjust the way in a lasting way adjust the way that society and politicians think about a given issue. So we can think, for example, about the Black Lives Matter protests around the world following the media storms that have happened following a few different key shootings. The thing to know about police shootings, at least in the US, is that they're pretty consistent over time. There isn't a big ebb and flow of how many people are killed by police in the United States every year. And there is really no change in how many unarmed Black people are killed by police. But when we look at news coverage of police killings, we can see that it's not even across the board. Instead, there are these few cases that, for whatever reason, happens to catch the public's interest. And some of them are pretty obvious. So we probably all know the name George Floyd, who was killed on video, and the graphic video helped to make it a media storm. But there are these other cases like Philando Castile, right, and Tamir Rice, where it's not so obvious. It's not so obvious why those items became media storms, as opposed to the thousands of others that did not. The point is that when there's a media storm that erupts, it can be this opportunity for change. The last example that I'll use is of the Boston Globe investigative reporting over months and years to uncover the systemic sexual abuse of children by some Catholic priests. And this series of reports that they released, it created a media storm. An interesting case, because it's not like there was one event that happened that news outlets rushed to. Instead, it was this deep investigative reporting that resulted in this release of these series of news articles. And what that did was it called all the other news outlets to flock to the Boston Globe reporting and to do their own follow-up reporting in that mimicking kind of way. So if we try to think about the effects of that media storm around the Catholic priest abuse scandal, then these stories hit in 2002. And if we look at all of the alleged abuse victims of the Catholic Church in the previous half century, so from 1950 to 2001, only a tiny fraction, less than 0.5% came forward in were abused in 2002. So that means that the abuse, it's not like it started in 2002, it had been happening for a long, long time. But if we look at the year that the survivor came forward, more than a third came forward in that year alone. And that suggests that this media storm was big enough to prompt some kind of a tipping point of social norms where it lessened the stigma for survivors. Okay, so I hope I have convinced you that media storms are important, but to date, we don't know what factors tend to predict them. So sometime if there's a graphic video, that might help it to make sense, but it's not clear whether it's just the case that an extraordinary event will always lead to extraordinary levels of news coverage. We think that the story is more complicated. And so we set out to do this book to ask what are the qualities that differentiate media storms from non-media storms. And so just yesterday, this book became available. And so I'll put the link that everyone can use. It's free forever for everyone because of open access. And in this book, we use mixed methods to try to answer this question. So we started by making a very long list of events that we suspected prompted a media storm. And we hired a very large team of talented undergraduates, and we sent them off on these wild goose chases. And we said, okay, take this event that we are pretty sure became a media storm, try to find us another event that was like that event that didn't become a media storm, which is a very hard challenge, right? It's like trying to find the dog that didn't bark. And what we did, though, was we were pretty successful in coming up with a very long list, not for everything, right? There's like no parallel of the September 11th attacks that didn't become a media storm, but there were a lot of parallels that we could find. And then we qualitatively compared all of the traits of the media storm event to the non-media storm event, thinking about the event itself, but also thinking about the surrounding political landscape. And these traits fell into three different categories. And so I'm going to present these three categories to you, and then I will close it for questions. These three categories, I am thrilled to tell you, fit nicely into a fire triangle model. So in the United States, we have Smokey Bear, who is a beloved bear, who is the mascot of the U.S. Forest Service, named after an actual bear that was rescued from a fire. But here's Smokey Bear in a 1980s image. If you see Smokey Bear today on the images, he is somehow now ripped, like he's been going to the gym and every day is arm day. It's very confusing, but this is my Smokey Bear. And so in Smokey Bear's triangle, this is a worldwide triangle, we need three elements to create a fire. We need heat, we need oxygen, and we need fuel. You probably remember this model from if you did any scouting days. And so in our model, you need these three different allegorical elements to create a media storm. And I'll walk through them to try to communicate clearly. And I'll give you an example in each case of a media storm and a non-media storm where the difference we think was predominantly because of that given element. So the first item is heat. And that's simply how newsworthy the event is, right? The perceived newsworthy of the event, how sensational it was, whether it involved a politician or a celebrity, how unexpected it was, if it had any photo or video or audio evidence. And our example here is between Britney Spears and Amanda Bynes. I don't know if you know who those people are, but Britney Spears and Amanda Bynes are both pop stars. They both came up through the Disney franchise, and they both were put in their late teens, early 20s into conservatorships with a parent because of mental health concerns. And so a conservatorship is where you judge deems that you're not capable of taking care of yourself and of making financial decisions. And so a parent is put, or somebody else is put in charge of making those decisions. But what that means is that then they have control over your finances, over your health decisions, over all kinds of things. So both Britney Spears and Amanda Bynes, these two pop stars, were in conservatorships for a long time because of mental health issues. But only Britney Spears, her conservatorship, at least in the US, became a media storm, and Amanda Bynes did not. And our basic argument is because Britney Spears is more famous than Amanda Bynes. Interestingly, Amanda Bynes' conservatorship ended right after Britney Spears' conservatorship ended, and we can be left to wonder whether one influenced the other. But in case you think that this is just a fun example involving pop stars, not the mental health part, but the pop star part, what was interesting to me about this case is that after Britney Spears, after the media storm, at least in the US, about Britney Spears' conservatorship, she was released from the conservatorship, but then all kinds of laws got put in on the books, at least in California, governing the clarity and transparency and the check-in timing of conservatorships. And so there was real policy change that happened because of this media storm around this single pop star. The next element is oxygen. And this one is how much attention the item gets from outside the traditional news media, from activists, from political actors, from the public. But it's also the current agenda space, the current amount of oxygen that is available on the news media in the first place. And so if Britney Spears' conservatorship had happened right after 9/11, then there wouldn't have been any oxygen to go around. But it's important, absent that there are people outside the traditional news media who are also amplifying, who are fanning the flames of the given media storm. And we haven't found a case of a media storm where there weren't politicians or celebrities or someone else talking about that event on social media or in press conferences or wherever. And our example here is the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. I realize that these are all American examples. You might not know what I'm talking about, but there was a terrible water crisis in Flint, Michigan. And the long story short is that there was lead poisoning in the water and then chemical poisoning in the water, and lots of kids got sick and have had and will now have lifelong disabilities because of it. There was basically the same water crisis in Newark, New Jersey around the same time. But the Flint, Michigan crisis got a media storm, and the Newark one did not. And our main finding about the difference between the two was only that there were people outside the traditional news media, so celebrities on social media and key politicians who talked about the Flint water crisis, and there was no one else talking about the Newark, New Jersey one. The final element is fuel, and this is what the political landscape is like. So the argument here is that even if it's a super sensational event, it'll definitely get media attention, but the only way it's going to become a media storm is if there's some way of hooking it in to what is happening right now or what has happened recently in a way that makes it cognitively accessible to the public. And that can take one of or both of two forms. Either there could be recent news coverage around the same topic or something similar, and or there can be something else happening in the political landscape that makes it easy to frame that event in a way that makes it resonant. But the idea here is basically that there has to be something to burn, right? There has to be something to hook onto to make it relevant and make it easier for people to appreciate. Our example here are these two tragic flight crashes of Boeing Airlines. One, the Lion Air flight was in October of 2018, and the Boeing Flight 302 was in March of 2019. Both of these flights crashed. They were both Boeing Airlines. They both killed nearly 200 people. There was almost nothing different about them, but the Boeing flight became a media storm and the Lion Air flight did not. And our simple argument is that it was because the Boeing flight, the Flight 302, came second. And because it came second and it came right on the heels of this other flight, all of a sudden that made a pattern. And because it made a pattern and people had heard a little bit about the Lion Air flight, it made it easier then for journalists to communicate about what was happening. Not just because people had been paying attention, a little bit of attention to this news event that wasn't a media storm, but was still a news event, but also because journalists then had done all of their homework to figure out, like, you know, what went wrong with the first plane, so they were better equipped to do the reporting for the second plane. That is our model. I'm very happy to answer questions. I just want to close by doing two things. First, by identifying what I think are the future questions that that researchers should be asking, and then I want to very briefly show you the website for this book because I'm very proud of it. So I think that the future questions are at least these three. First, and maybe foremost, do media storm patterns vary by media system? So we're scholars in the US and we wrote this book predominantly around United States cases, but media storms are a phenomenon that happen around the world, especially in democratic media systems, but also in non-democratic media systems too. And we think that probably there are a couple of different factors across different media systems that that affect the frequency of media storms and how volatile they are, so how explosive media storms are. But it's a big open question for future research. I also want to know whether media storms are becoming more frequent because of our increasingly fragmented media system, especially in countries like the US, but across the world. And maybe finally, are they overall good or bad for society? Like, we could argue that, you know, the media storm surrounding the second airplane was good for society because now we all know a lot more about the intricacies of the flight navigational system. And the Britney Spears media storm led to arguably very good policy changes. But those media storms came at the expense of talking about other things in a more even-handed way, like, you know, like education. Okay, that's my slide deck, but I want to just show you very briefly, if I may, this set of let's see, this website here. I'm going to find my thing. I'm going to share my screen. I can do it. I'm going to share a window. There we go. All right. So this book is out. It has open access, so it's free for everyone forever. I'm so excited. But the thing I wanted to tell you about is this appendix where we have resources for instructors. We have details about our coding protocols. But what I'm most excited about are all of these case-by-case comparisons where we took a media storm and its parallel event that did not become a media storm, and we wrote up what the differences were. And so you can just play it, or you can click through, and you can see all of these different cases that we did, and we're very proud of it. So there's the airline one that I mentioned there. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much, Amber, for this really fascinating presentation. Love the visuals. Also, very nice. I really like also the website you built. Could be very useful resource. So thanks a lot. I already saw one person put a question in the chat. I think it's Arturo.